I'd like to welcome everybody to today's session by acknowledging that we're meeting on traditional Aboriginal lands across the country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to pay respects to and stand in solidarity with all Indigenous people joining us today from all over the world. My name is Alison Barnes and I'm National President of the National Tertiary Education Union. I'd like to welcome you all to today's forum, Universities at a Turning Point. It's fantastic to have so many mighty NTEU members here, but I'd also like to welcome those of you who might be considering joining our union. We can achieve so much when we stand together. And finally, I'd like to welcome our international participants. It's great to be with you all as part of Education International, our global union federation's launch of its international campaign for public funding for public universities. With the federal budget's release last night, this meeting will be an important first opportunity to assess its implications for our sector. It's been less than 24 hours since the budget's release, so we will be holding additional Q&A session next week where there will be further opportunity to ask questions. If you'd like to attend, you can register for this session. You'll find a link in the chat. As foreshadowed by Jason Clare, the Education Minister, in last night's budget, this budget is part of the biggest reform process that higher education in Australia has faced over the last 15 years. We need to ensure that NTEU members' concerns are heard by and reflected in government action. While over 20,000 members and community supporters have acted over the last year in support of our Accord campaign, we need to maintain and grow this campaign. If you would like to be involved, you can find a link in the chat, and I encourage you all to stand with us and push for the changes that we need. I'd now like to introduce and warmly welcome our speakers. Our first speaker is Susan Hopgood. Susan is President of Education International and former Federal Secretary of the Australian Education Union. Susan is going to open our discussion by introducing Education's International Go Public campaign. I'm then going to pass to Professor Julian Garritzmann. Julian is a political scientist at Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. He specialises in the politics of higher education, and today Julian will be discussing his work exploring public funding of higher education globally. And finally, I'm going to pass to our Policy and Research Unit, who I need to do a shout out. They've been up for about basically the last 48 hours working on the budget. Kieran McCarran and Terri MacDonald are going to present their initial analysis of our budget. I'd now like to pass to you, Susan.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Alison, and good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. And thanks very much for you all joining. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am joining this meeting from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and also pay my respects to all Indigenous people who are joining this webinar today. I want to thank the NTEU for hosting the event and for the solidarity and leadership that President Alison Barnes has shown for driving this initiative and linking it so directly to the Go Public Fund Education campaign. And a special thanks as well to Julian Garritzmann for the very impactful research that we are going to hear about. Since the beginning of 2023, Education International has been engaged in a global campaign that is essential to the future of teachers, education support personnel, and of education globally, across all levels. Why a global campaign? Well, simply put, education and the systems that support it are in crisis. The teacher shortage that UNESCO estimates at greater than 40 million across the globe is not only massive, it is growing, and it has brought crushing workloads to educators and is literally driving members of a profession away from the work they love. Millions of the most vulnerable children and young people don't have learning opportunities because of inadequate environments, untrained teachers, and a lack of educational resources. Girls are disproportionately affected. They have historically been the last in their families to be allowed access to schools, the first to be forced to leave schools in times of crisis, and the hardest to get back to school when that option is again available. Colleagues, you need to know that none of us is facing these issues alone, and far from it. It is a central concern of our Federation.
Okay.
380 organisations in 180 countries and territories, together representing 32 million teachers and education workers from preschool to university. I'm privileged to visit with our members in many parts of the world, and I can tell you that we are all dealing with issues like inadequate investment in education, growing privatisation and infringement of the rights of teachers, the increasing casualisation of our profession, issues of pay, pension and social security, and essential threats to civil society, the public sector, to democracy, and because of climate change, threats to the very lands on which we live. The Go Public Fund Education campaign is an urgent call for increased public funding for quality education and the teaching profession, and a global mobilisation to resist budget cuts, austerity and privatisation, and create well-resourced, equitable, inclusive public education systems that value teachers and education support personnel. We have put into the chat the link to the background that you can see on some people's backgrounds. You might like to download that and perhaps show it during this webinar. Later on during the webinar, we will take a photo of all who are joining us. As you well know, in the higher and further education and research sector, chronic and structural underfunding, increasing privatisation, precarity and inequalities are universal concerns and are challenging the ability of the sector to serve the public and common good. In October 2023, EI member organisations convened in Mexico City for EI's 12th Further and Higher Education and Research Conference, and in a joint statement highlighted that further and higher education is a human right, integral to the advancement of society, and joined the Go Public Fund Education campaign in calling for governments to engage in meaningful social dialogue and collective bargaining with unions. The statement further urged governments to introduce progressive tax reforms, end austerity, and forward debt relief initiatives to ensure sustainable, predictable and unconditional public funding for quality and accessible public further and higher education and research. It is the responsibility of governments to counter privatisation, commercialisation trends that make existing inequalities worse and ensures security of employment, including tenure or its functional equivalent, decent work, academic freedom, pay equity, quality professional development and training opportunities for staff. These conditions are essential to quality further and higher education and research. In the beginning of 2024, as we marked the one-year anniversary of the Go Public Fund Education campaign, we also welcomed the release of the recommendations of the UN Secretary-General's high-level panel on the teaching profession. Drawing on expertise from ministries of education and labour, employers' organisations, teacher unions and others, the panel set out a clear plan of action to transform the teaching profession into a high-status, high-qualified, well-supported, properly remunerated and highly respected profession, which is capable of guiding and promoting inclusive, effective and relevant learning. I was proud to be one of the voices of the profession on the panel. Applying to all levels of education from early childhood through tertiary education, its recommendations represent a turning point in global education policy making, recognising that investing in well-qualified and well-supported teachers is an investment in the quality and sustainability of our education systems. In fact, the recommendations reiterate and reinforce many provisions of the 1997 recommendation concerning the status of higher education teaching personnel, concerning salaries, employment conditions and job security, gender equity and diversity, and social dialogue and collective bargaining. The panel's recommendations also cover new ground, like promoting teachers' mental health and holistic well-being, and advancing human-centred education technology, with a strong focus on gender equity and inclusion throughout. Colleagues, this is historic. For the first time in any of our lifetimes, there is a global agreement, not only about the challenges facing education systems and the teaching profession, but about the specific steps all of us can take in concert to make real progress. Our goal is nothing short of a new social contract that connects the crisis in funding to the sustainable world we want to create. Further and higher education is a critical part of this vision. This meeting provides an opportunity for us all to examine and discuss the findings of EI's new report, Higher Education Funding Across the Globe, which stresses that although there is a trend towards more spending in tertiary education over time, on average, public spending remains below the 1% target globally and warns about huge regional disparities in further and higher education and research funding, as the largest increases are to be found in already high spending countries in Nordic Europe and North America. The report provides critical evidence towards the necessity of our continual collective efforts to increase public investment in further higher education and research. We'll also hear from our hosts, the NTEU, and gain insight into the features of public funding for higher education and research here in Australia, as unions are mobilising for increasing the budget for the sector. As we know all too well, colleagues, there's only one way to get the public's resources for the public good. There is only one way forward to create a sustainable world, and that way is to mobilise our unions, our education systems, and our communities to build and maintain a consensus for democratic governance and a vibrant public sector, engage our governments, and hold them accountable to fund the future through quality education. From all of your colleagues and allies in Education International, thank you for your leadership.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susan. And now I'd like to introduce Julian.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks a lot, Alison. Thanks a lot, Susan, and everyone else involved in organizing this event. It's a big pleasure to be in Australia, even if only virtually. And as Susan just said a minute ago, I was invited to work on this report presented in Mexico, and was super happy to work on this. And will be, that's my understanding, available soon online, also if you're looking for some of the details that I'm going to show you. So what my plan is basically is to give you a global overview on how higher education funding has developed. And at the end, I'll also talk a bit about why that actually is the case. So what are the determinants? So I'll talk about this from an analytical perspective, but of course you can also flip this around and turn it into a political campaign, because it will tell you under what conditions it is more likely that you can increase funding. All right, but let's start very briefly and general. Why should we actually care about funding? I think many of you anyways do already. But there's by now lots of research that tells us that the type of funding, the way we fund education, has very important consequences for many things, including economic growth, including the type of inequality we have, including what type of employment we have, and so on. So to just give one example, we know by now very well that the way how we fund financial student aid has big impacts on educational inequality. So the better and the more generous our financial student aid systems, the more we are able to include people from different strata of society and therefore reach educational equality. And the flip side is basically true for tuition fees. So we know that tuition fees basically scare off children from lower socioeconomic strata who are not growing up in such rich families. So kind of the degree of tuition fees that we have and the type of tuition fees we have contributes to educational inequality, as well as in the long term to wage inequality. So these are just basically two examples. There's another one written out on the slides that you can look at. Just to say funding matters. And of course, funding is not the only thing that matters in education. Funding is just basically one element of policy making, but I think it's a very important one because it affects many, many outcomes. And I think it's politically also a very important one. Because of course, it's rather easy to understand. So if you tell people the government is spending more or the government is spending less, that's, I think, what the general public can understand as well. So it has a lot of political impact to talk about funding. All right, but let me show you some data and some trends. And I do most of this basically in graphs, because I think that's the easiest to be looking at. So what I'm showing you here is information for more than 100 countries from around the globe, and how much the government there is spending on higher education. And what you observe is basically, as Susan said, the mean value is still below 1%, so it's about 0.83. So I always find it difficult to put a total benchmark on this, but probably one benchmark could be that we have this goal to spend on defense in the NATO countries around 2% of our GDPs. So this is kind of well below. But as you see, there's lots of variations. So some countries are spending close to 0, and some countries are around 3%. Which countries are where? It's probably difficult to read on the slide, but the countries that are spending a lot are basically the ones in Europe, especially Northern Europe, in North America and some parts of Latin America. And on the other side, we find most countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. Australia, just to highlight this, is kind of here at the bottom of the upper third. Yeah, just to flag this. How has this developed? Susan mentioned this already. So globally, we actually see an increase in the total spending amounts. So between 2006 and 2018, the amounts have actually doubled, which I think is great news. And when you look at which regions are spending more, we see that the global share that Europe and North America have spent has actually decreased. So kind of globally speaking, Europe and North America are losing out, if you want to call it this way. And it's especially Eastern and Southeast Asia that is catching up a lot. We can also look at this then a bit more specifically by looking at the same numbers that I just showed you here, kind of as a share of the number of students we have. And what you see then is that there's actually an increase in Europe and North America. So per student, these countries are spending more and more. And other countries that are expanding a lot, like Asia, basically don't see that much of a raise. So put differently, what's the main takeaway here? It's especially the high spending countries that continue increasing spending, which is what we sometimes call a Matthew effect. So those that are given, so kind of this Bible quote. And in Asia, we see increases as well, but they are mainly driven by the fact that more and more students are attending higher education, and less so by an increase in the amount of money spent per student. When we look at changes, here's the most recent change that we have data for, the change between 2019 and 2020. You see that there are quite big differences across the globe. So some countries like Mexico, the Czech Republic, Romania, Israel, the UK have actually cut spending recently. And others like the Slovak Republic, Slovenia, and Lithuania have actually expanded this a lot. The OECD average is somewhere close to 0. It's a little negative. So I would say there are some recent drastic changes. Much of this is related to the COVID pandemic, when GDP was going down in many countries and also spending was being targeted elsewhere. But my warning would be basically, sorry, that we should always interpret these short-term changes against the long-term trends. So for example, in Canada, we see on this slide an increase recently. But if we look at this over a long term of 40 years or so, we actually see a decline in Canada and just very recently a change. And yeah, basically the vice versa story in the Czech Republic. Australia, once again, is here. And I know that there are many experts on the Australian case. And someone's going to talk about the current budget in a minute. But here are these long-term trends. So I am showing you the trends basically from 1970 until today in a selection of countries. So we also have the information for all of the countries, but then we kind of get drowned in the data. So I'm just showing you this here for some representative cases from around the globe. And there's super much interesting variation, but my main takeaway would be that usually public spending changes very, very, very slowly. So sometimes there are some changes, but most of the lines are rather flat. So it's very difficult actually to change funding. It's not impossible at all, but it's not, or usually empirically, we don't see that the spending is doubled or tripled or something in a certain year. Usually we see these really incremental changes over many, many years. And so far I've been talking about public spending, so the money that the government is spending. On this slide here, you see both public spending and private spending. So this dark gray is basically the share that households are spending, so mostly in the form of tuition fees. And then this light gray is other private entities. And what you see once again is that there's lots of variation. So here on the right side, we have countries, especially in Northern Europe, that mostly have public spending. And on the left side here, we have a couple of countries, especially Anglo-Saxon countries, but also Japan and some of the Latin American countries, where we do have a significant share of private spending as well. So as you know, there are quite significant tuition fees in many of these countries. Australia, once again, and I think most of you are very aware of that as well, is also in this box. So there's tons of private spending, which on a global scale is a lot. And we can also delve much more into the details and look at what exactly is this money being spent on. And I'm usually showing this graph to show you it's really like delving into a rabbit hole. So there's tons of details that we could be looking at. So for example, if the money is spent on public or private, or whether the money comes from public or private sources. And then let's say it's private money, whether it's from households or companies. If it's from households, whether it's tuition fees or donations. If it's tuition fees, what kinds of tuition fees, and so on. So it becomes very quickly very technical. But of course, often kind of the devil is in the detail, because all these technical details basically determine whether a certain type of funding increases inequality, decreases inequality, and so on. But I don't want to bombard you with all of this detailed information, rather again show some global trends. So here's the data for financial student aid in very general terms. So what we see overall globally is basically an increase until the financial crisis and Great Recession, and afterwards a slow decrease in the share of financial student aid. But we do see that the amounts are still much higher in the so-called global north than they are in the global south. Here's another way to look at this data. So what I'm showing you here on the y-axis is the average annual amount of tuition fees that students are paying. And of course, this is only an average. So some students will be paying much, much more. Some students will be paying much less. But there's lots of variation globally. And on the x-axis here from left to right, you see the share of students receiving financial student aid. And what I usually like to highlight is that there are these four worlds of student finance. So in some countries like England, the US, and also Australia, tuition fee is high, but also a significant share of students receive some form of financial student aid, often in the form of loans, sometimes in the form of grants and other benefits. In especially the Scandinavian countries, there's basically no tuition fees, but still a lot of students are receiving financial student aid. Then in countries like my own in Germany and lots of other continental European countries, tuition is low and hardly any students are supported. And then we have the combination that we see in Japan, Korea, and others, where we have significant amounts of tuition fees and basically very little support schemes. I'm also showing you here the data split up by the share that is going basically to people, so to staff, and the share that is going to other expenditures. And what I want to highlight is that basically in all the countries that I have data for, and most of the spending goes to people, so most of the spending goes to staff. The number is, or the average is basically 67%, which is lower than the mean number for non-higher education. So put differently, in schools, even more of the money goes to teaching staff, which makes sense because equipment and everything else is very expensive in higher education. But again, you see that there's variation. So it's especially the countries that are kind of low spenders that spend more on stuff, and the countries that are already spending more spend more on equipment, which again makes sense because they are more research intense. And then you see lots of variation in basically what kinds of stuff they are spending money on. So let me just highlight the difference between two countries. So in Luxembourg, a lot of the money goes to non-teaching stuff. And in, for example, Austria, a very minor share goes to non-teaching stuff. Australia, once again, is here. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. I was also asked in the report, especially to talk a little about so-called performance-based funding, because it's kind of has become a buzzword in the politics of higher education funding to talk more about performance-based funding. And again, it becomes very quickly very technical, and I want to avoid this and rather stick to the more general patterns. And what's important to say then is that, let's say you have a fixed amount of money that you're spending, then of course you can spend this money in very different ways. So you can give this like a block to the entire higher education sector, or you can make it very project specific, or you can say, no, this is going to be based on performance. So for example, on graduation rates or on publication numbers or on, I don't know, some gender quotas. If there are so and so many women in higher education, then you get more funding or so. So there's lots of types of performance that we could be looking at. And it's a huge normative ongoing debate. We don't have very good information on this, actually. So we only have very good information on a few West European countries, basically. But already this information tells us that there's a lot of variation in how much countries are using performance-based funding. So in some countries like Denmark and Finland, there actually the majority of money is allocated based on performance. And in others like Italy and Poland, that's much less the case. And there's a huge range of different criteria involved. So some countries focus a lot only on quantitative indicators, like how many students do you have, what's your graduation rate, and so on. And others take a more qualitative view. So where experts, maybe like myself or others, are evaluating a certain country and saying, this country is doing so and so well in terms of performance. I think the second big question is then usually, does it actually work? So does performance-based funding work? Again, this is not the end of the story yet. So there's lots of ongoing research and many things we don't know yet. But by now we have a couple of meta-analyses. So they are like quantitative literature reviews, basically. And they mainly show there are basically no effects on study completion rates. So performance-based funding doesn't help, but it also doesn't hurt, basically. So on average, at least, there's basically a null effect. But sometimes it can have so-called unintended consequences. So for example, it leads higher education institutions to kind of game the system. So if they know that they get more money if the graduation rates are higher, then usually they become more selective in terms of what students they take in, just to make sure they are kind of fulfilling those criteria. There's also some evidence that researchers become more risk averse and kind of focus on more normal science things if they know, okay, if I get a certain number of publications, my university gets more money. So I don't want to say I don't want to say performance-based funding is bad or it's good. So I think it really depends on what outcomes we are looking at. Let me skip this and maybe just focus on the politics a little, and I'm happy to come back to research and development funding in the Q&A if you like. So why do we actually see all this variation in the higher education funding? I usually like to highlight that there are three big types of explanations, or three big groups of factors that are affecting what kinds of funding we have. The first group is socioeconomic factors. A second is political actors, and the third one is institutions. Let me just highlight a few of those. So for example, we know that demographics matter. For example, simply if you have more children in a country, usually you also have more education spending simply because there's more demand. But also there are these so-called indirect effects. So if you have very, very many old people, you need more pension spending, but also older people tend to rather vote for the conservative parties. On average, once again, there are lots of outliers. And that, of course, then affects politics. But so demographics matter. It's also that economics matter a lot. So it's much easier to increase public spending in times of economic prosperity. It's extremely hard, if not impossible, to do it in terms of or in times of fiscal austerity. We know that, for example, globalization can help because it shifts spending towards higher education in high income countries, but actually towards primary and secondary education in lower income countries. We know that there's a certain relationship with the female labor force participation rate for several reasons. Second, we know that political actors matter, so spending usually is much higher when we have left-leaning governments. We also know that unions matter, which I guess is good news for you. So when you have a more active union, usually that pushes for more spending. And let me just highlight here, we know that democracy matters for several reasons. So maybe last sentence, I should say, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues. So what are basically favorable conditions for public spending? Well, it's easiest to increase public spending when you have a strong economy, when you have a young population, when you have low public debt, when you don't have any fiscal austerity, either objectively or a discourse around fiscal austerity, when you have an economy that focuses on basically a high-skilled post-industrial knowledge economy rather than a very industrial economy, when you have left-wing governments, when you have trade unions that aim to include all workers rather than being very sectional trade unions, and when you have a very weak legacy of private investment in a country. So let me conclude there. Funding, I think, is very important. It's just one indicator that is at the same time, a very easy indicator and a very complex one. Globally, we see the rise of spending, but it's a lot of variation that we see across countries. And I would say basically stability is the norm, but change isn't impossible. All right, I'll stop there and hope that was helpful. Very much looking forward to questions in the Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Garritzmann. I'm now going to pass to Terri MacDonald, Dr. Terri MacDonald, Director of our Public Policy and Research Unit, who's going to give an overview of last night's budget. Terri.
Thank you very much. And I would like to kick off by thanking Julian and also Susan for their presentations. I'd like to acknowledge the lands of the First Nations people that I am currently speaking from, the Wurundjeri. And I would like to acknowledge all First Nations people who have joined us today. Sovereignty was never ceded here, and wherever you are too, I would expect to. So if I'm just going to go very quickly to share screen. And Julian, I found your presentation both interesting and timely. I have a feeling that Australia is going to be a case study for much of what you are talking about, sadly in some respects and, interestingly in others. So very quickly, I'm going to just flick through and I'm going to talk to things. Now, I assume people could read dot points themselves, so I don't usually read them out bit by bit, but I will highlight a few points for people. So for those who don't know, who might be joining us internationally, the Australian higher education system has been undergoing a review for the last 18 months or so, and it's now part of what they call the Universities Accord process. We had our federal government gave its federal budget launch last night, which is why we're looking a little bit tired. And we have done a quick analysis of some of the reforms that have been announced. Now, these are linked to the Universities Accord, that the government is responding to the recommendations of that report. It's very clear that it's going to be a marathon, not a sprint. And when I say it's going to be a marathon, this is going to go on for years, decades even. So that's the kind of thing when Julian says that, you know, higher education funding doesn't change overnight. This is true. It is going to take us a good decade or so. So for us, there is new money, but it's very much focused on programs and initiatives, most of which were already leaked by the government the lead up. There isn't new money for Commonwealth grant schemes, which is the funding that's attached to per students here in Australia, the government funding. The majority of the funding is going to, for example, new Commonwealth prac payments. Now, these for Australians, these will be benchmarked to the single Austudy rate and go towards teaching, nursing, midwifery, social work, for example, but nowhere else at the moment. There's also, however, going to be some money for students, eligible students in vet in those areas, around, you know, 58 million or so. From 1st of July, eligible students will be able to access a payment of around $319.50 a week, which is helpful, but not going to really, you know, go that far for many of them. However, it is a start. The government's also flagged that it's going to be talking to the professional accreditation bodies around the hours that, you know, students are required, which is something which the trade unions here may be interested in. And moving on very quickly, the government also announced with a great deal of fanfare that they were going to cap the help indexation rate for those who are international. The help indexation is the Higher Education Loans Program, which is the tuition fee system here in Australia that students access in order to be able to go to university, to pay for it. It goes towards the tuition fees. It's a loan system. Now, unfortunately, was, you know, previously very much impacted by the increase in the indexation. So the government has now decided that it's going to be the lower of either the CPI or the wage price index. And essentially, it brings back about $3 billion to the students. So it is a significant measure. It will extend, I should say, not only to help, but to vet student loan, Australian apprenticeship loans, and other kinds of student loans. The government will also provide another 27 odd million to improve what it's calling tertiary harmonisation. Now, this has come out of the Accord. We are still finding out some of what this is about, but essentially it's talking about better pathways between vocational education and higher education, improving regulatory approaches for these dual sectors, including around TAFEs, and also creating better data sets. Importantly, though, it's going to be this process that allows some of our TAFEs to become self-accrediting for level 5 qualifications and above. That is diploma level and above. So that's a very big change. Very quickly, some other initiatives to note. The National Student Ombudsman, which is something that we had actually, oh, sorry, I'll flick forward. We had actually pushed for, so that's quite important. There will also be an announcement recently around a higher education racism study. Now, this is going to be led by the Race Discrimination Commissioner. It will be looking at the prevalence and impact of racism in universities. It's going to develop recommendations. It will be consulting with student stakeholder groups and education providers. There is a reference group that is going to be announced shortly that will have a variety of people on it. And of course, you know, there's a few other bits and pieces there which are worth noting, including 40% of student amenities fees now to go to student-led organisations. I should point out that the government has cut funding to the QUILT program. They're taking out $8 million over 4 years to help pay for it. And the Destinations Australia program, which was essentially the rejigged Colombo program, has essentially been axed to pay for these measures. So More reforms. These are the ones that have been announced, but we are yet to see. And this is where we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty of regulatory reform, funding reform. It's quite big. So ATEC, which is the secret which everyone knew about, essentially, that is supposed to be kicking off 1st of July 2025. It's going to be huge. It's going to have the current education regulators, which are TEXA and ASPA, will sit under it. We believe the ARC will as well. It will have regulatory policy oversight, deliver funding. It's going to be doing analysis, policy research. It's going to be very, very big. So the government has said it's going to consult with states and territories about its role in relation to VET, which is going to be quite important. Again, that's going to be one of those things which they say they're going to consult with the sector over. Managed growth funding. This is the new funding system, which will be linked to Commonwealth supported places to meet student demand. The government says they want to maintain sustainable growth and use it to increase opportunity for people for more people from underrepresented backgrounds. So this is that equity agenda. The new funding system will include targets for universities that encourage growth consistent with overall attainment targets. Now, these are going to be set in consultation with government by each institution, we think. Funding will be on a per place basis up to university level enrolment targets. And it will also provide demand-driven funding for places for equity students, although it's not necessarily at their chosen university. Now, that will be linked with the new managed growth funding system, which will have transition elements. So it will, as the new system takes over. And this new needs-based funding system is to be a core component of funding for higher education in teaching and learning. Again, this is going to that equity side of things. It's going to be intended to boost numbers from students from underrepresented backgrounds to not only get through, be enrolled, but to get through their degree and to complete. And it will be implemented per student. We'll implement per student funding contributions to better support students from underrepresented backgrounds. So that's essentially what we're looking at the moment in terms of information that we've got. Now, on the research front, I really wish we had more news. The government has announced that it's going to commission another examination, this time of research and development. In Australia, for those who might be interested, our R&D in Australia tends to be pushed very much by the higher education sector, by universities. Businesses don't necessarily engage and do much. Governments over many decades have tried very hard to get businesses to do more around R&D. We are yet to get there. However, they've announced a new Future Made in Australia initiative that does have some money for R&D. There's things like 566 million for geosciences and 1.7 billion to support innovative green technology. So there's a range of things in that, but really not much there. So federal budget, just very quickly, moving on for the Indigenous Student Success Program. Thank you to Adam, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Policy Officer for Director of Policy for putting this together. Unfortunately, this budget has seen a slight reduction in the ISAG and the ISSP program funding. Just to explain, the Indigenous Student Assistance Grants and the Indigenous Student Success Program are key funding allocations which support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in support centres which they have in institutions and their staff. It provides funding allocations to all Table A and B higher education providers, essentially, to assist students with appropriate tutorial and cultural support. It's actually quite important. While no funding increase has been seen, one positive though was that it can be taken from the federal budget that the forward estimates, which is the spending into the future from last year's budget, have been on it. So they have continued that forward. Now, international education. This is a big one for us. So international education has been a focus of the government really since international borders reopened again post-COVID. However, the post-COVID spike in migration numbers in Australia, nearly which of half around of that are international students, has created both policy and political issues for the government. Higher education providers, especially universities, over many decades, but particularly from about 2017 onwards, have become very reliant on international student fee income, some more than others. And so for many, they use it to support their research, but for some, they also use it to support their domestic teaching as well. It's been quite an issue. The other problem that has gone in hand with this massive increase in international student numbers in Australia is trafficking of labour. The easiest way to traffic labour into Australia, unfortunately, has been on a student visa in the past, so it is a problem. Having said that, it's a very important component of education in this country. It's one of our biggest export industries, and it's very important to the collegiality and internationalisation of higher education in Australia. Now, having said all that, we've been very supportive of the measures that the government had introduced to date, which have been targeting some of the very dodgy private providers and just providers who haven't been, up to scratch. We've had migration agents, student migration agents who have not been doing the right thing, as well as lifting the bar for things like English language and genuine student requirements for students to come to Australia. It's very important that students, are able to succeed when they're here, that they're not being set up to fail from the start, that they're not just being viewed essentially as funding opportunities. However, with these new changes, there have been some what we call uneven outcomes for some providers. And there has been some justified criticism of the implementation of some of the government's policies. There's been some things that had to be ironed out. Now, having said that, the government has very recently generated further concern when last Sunday it made an announcement that it was going to bring in what they call a managed growth strategy around international student numbers. And this was going to be within a new international education framework. We do have some real concerns about what we've heard and what we've been told about this. Of course, we haven't seen legislation, we haven't seen anything else, we haven't been officially consulted yet, so that's all down the track. But we will certainly be pushing some very strong views around the need to ensure there's no unintended consequences, and that international students, of course, are appropriately supported while they're here. And finally, one of the big announcements, of course, with the federal government was that they're going to bring in an implementation committee to start to bring about the recommendations of the University Accord Report, which I should mention there's about 47 of. So these are very, very big recommendations. That's the committee there on screen, which of course we will know some of those people in Australia, and some of them we probably will find out a little bit more about. But it's going to be a very big process, or big, important process. Unfortunately, there is no union representation on this committee, which we have noted. Universities Australia is also not recommended on this committee, and I noticed that there is no students recommended on this committee either. So we do have a number of concerns to start with in terms of how this is going to be rolled out. But having said that, we're at the very start of what is likely to be another long marathon. And I will leave it at that, Alison.
Thank you, Terri. Thanks for that presentation. If I could get you to take down your slides, that would be great. I'd like to encourage everyone to upload the background if you can, so Education International can take some photos for this global launch. So while we move for a few minutes for questions, it would be great if you could upload the background. I'm going to start with questions for you, Julian. We've received lots in advance, so I might just start off with a couple, and then we might open it up for general questions. NTEU members, you'll have another opportunity next week to ask more questions about the budget, given the limits on time today. Julian, should free higher education be means tested against family income?
Good question, and an important one. So in research, we usually like to distinguish three ways how you can do this. So one is what we call inclusive, that basically everyone gets the same benefit. The second one is what we call targeted, so that it's basically means tested. You would give it to the poorest family or the least advantaged or so. And the third one is what we call stratified. so that there are several ways that policies are more likely to benefit the middle class or the upper classes. And I think countries are taking different roads, and you see different results of that. I think it's by now very clear that if you either do the means testing or the inclusive approach, that you reduce inequality. So if you are in favor of kind of fighting inequality, both inclusiveness and means testing works. So which one is better? Should we go for means testing or should we go for inclusive? I think there's an economic logic to this and there's a political logic to this. So economically speaking, I think means testing has many benefits because it's just way less expensive than inclusive approaches. So inclusive approaches, of course, require much more funding because you basically give the same funding to everyone. And so if you have limited resources, probably means testing is the way to go. But this, at the same time, you have this political logic that usually more people increasingly get in favor of a certain policy if it's inclusive. So if it's mean tested, it might be that those who receive the benefit are very much in favor, but everyone else is not so much because they are basically paying for this and not so much being in favor. So you have a bit of this tension that I would say it's hard to say. So both means testing and inclusive will reduce inequality. But politically, probably inclusiveness is the cleaner way if you have the funds available. I hope that answers the question well enough.
Fantastic, thank you. And a second question, how do you convince European policymakers to increase funding for research and education in all EU countries?
Yeah, also a good one and important one. Maybe, one of the key questions also for Education International and all its collaborators. Well, I think mainly refer back to the final slide I showed you, that it's much more likely under some conditions than under others. So try to look for those conditions or try to kind of create those conditions. But of course, sometimes you can't, right? So it's really hard to affect demographic aging. If you are in a society like Japan or like Germany that are super old, it's really hard to kind of work against this. So I think then it's a lot about how you are framing these issues. So how exactly you talk about funding, that it basically has lots of positive effects, especially on economic growth, on social inclusion, on social upward mobility, and many other things. So I think my suggestion would be try to frame the policy so that it's beneficial economically and socially, and don't frame it as trade-offs. So as soon as there are some trade-offs involved, like, okay, increasing spending will at the same time mean more taxation, or increasing spending on this will mean a decrease on that. So as soon as that happens, basically it's really, really hard to do policy reforms. And maybe last thing I'd say is more concrete. So what I'm always lobbying for, and I think basically the majority of economists are at the same time as well, is that we think by now social investments like higher education should not be part of the fiscal rules. So I think investments should be really outside of the standard budget rules. They shouldn't count against your budget deficit. They shouldn't count against your public debt, because of course social investments on average will rather create economic growth and therefore at the end of the day kind of in a long term pay for themselves. So I don't know if that works. Sometimes it does, sometimes not, but that would be my strategy.
Thanks so much. I'm going to open up to the floor for one quick question. Then we're all going to raise our fists and take a photo for the campaign. So if anybody would like to ask a question, otherwise I'll go to some of the questions that have been submitted in advance. Okay, I can't see anyone. Miriam, raised hand function. Miriam's used the raised hand function. We can't see you.
Can you see me now?
No, we can hear you though.
Oh, okay.
How do?
Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for this incredibly interesting and stimulating debate. I have a question for Julian, but also for the comrade from Australia. So my question relates to what Julian mentioned as the political context where public investments are discussed and sometimes increased. You did mention the role of trade unions. So I would like to know if you could tell us a little bit more about the relation between trade union campaigns or activities, strikes, or other type. If you could tell us more in your study, what has emerged as the most significant, we can say, tools that trade unions have in order to influence budget and public spending. If it is, yes, through traditional means like obviously strikes or boycotts, or if it is, I don't know, through building alliances. I know your study is quite broad, so I'm not sure you could actually you have looked at that in particular, but just according to your current study, if you could tell us more about the role of the unions. Thank you.
Should I respond, Alison, or do you want to collect more
Yes.
questions?
Just very quick response because we're about to run out of time.
Okay, then super quickly, honest answer is we don't know, because there's not so much work on the politics of higher education yet. It's a pretty young field, but there's super much work by now on the role of trade unions on other policies, social policies, and vocational training. And I think what this work shows is that on average, they are much more powerful when working together, when kind of working in an inclusive way. And of course, in political systems that are corporatist, so basically where they have privileged access to policymakers. And there's more to say, but maybe I'll stop there.
I'd really like to say thank you to our international guests for coming along. We know you're up it's early in the morning and late at night, so thank you so much for joining us. For those of us in Australia, if you have further questions, we'll be holding an additional session next week, so please register and come along. I think today's presentations really highlight the need for us to be organised to deal with the problems that we face across higher education, both in Australia and internationally. So if you're not a member of the NTEU, please join. And if you'd like to join our campaign as we push for changes to our sector that work for staff and students, please see the link in the chat and join. We are much stronger when we stand together. If you could all join me in thanking our excellent presenters, Susan, Julian, Terri, and Kieran, who didn't get to say anything. If you could all join me in giving them a clap, that would be fantastic. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. Really appreciate it. And thank you very much for your presentations, everybody. Take care and solidarity with you all. Thanks so much.